Welcome to this episode of the NLN podcast, Nursing EDge Unscripted. I am Raquel Bertiz. I am the host of this episode, and I am from the National League for Nursing. In this episode, we'll have an interesting conversation around pedagogical preparation of nurse educator, and our guest for today, I'll start with Dr. Amber Young-Brice. She's an associate professor and associate dean for academic affairs at Marquette University College of Nursing. And Dr. Kyla Farrar Stern is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. And our two nurse educators with us today wrote a very interesting article calling for a change in expectations, a policy recommendation for future and current educators in the Journal of Professional Nursing. So welcome, Amber and Kyla. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right. So let me ask you, what inspired or informed your interest in nurse educator preparation?
Yeah, so I'll take this first. So for me, as a newer nurse compared to Amber at least, just kind of reflecting on my own transition experience, going from a nursing student to a bedside nurse, and then again shortly after transitioning to academic nursing or teaching. It was kind of a whirlwind experience, and there were some bumps in the road, I would say, and that was kind of what informed my interest is how do we make that better for future students? What can I do to help that transition?
I would have to agree with Kyla that thinking about going through school, even starting back in elementary school, things were not easy for me. And I constantly, through all phases of my education, trying to figure out what do teachers want from me and spending all of that brain power trying to just figure that part out and then really missing out on a lot of key learning moments. And so like Kyla, I developed this desire to help students have a better experience than I had and really try to cut back on all of that guessing that students tend to waste their brain space on. And so that's really how Kyla and I met, is we both had this similar interest in nursing education, which then developed into doing research together. And so we've done a few projects together, with students or with faculty, but all really around nursing education and how do we best support student success from both sides.
Wow, yeah, that's very interesting, and it's also kind of like a very similar theme across the board as I talk to a lot of educators, and we look back at how we were all educated as nursing students, and I would say at the back of our minds, like, I wish I could have been educated differently, or what would have been my experience if I had a different experience. And that goes back to our nurse educators, right? So now that we're all nurse educators as well, it's really high time for us to examine what's our pedagogical preparation, or how are we being prepared to educate and be at that place now where we can really influence the preparation of our future nurses. So with that said, what have you identified as primary factors contributing to the gap in the pedagogical preparation among nurse educators? And I'm almost already claiming there is a gap, right? So maybe we should start with that, right? Do you think there's a gap in pedagogical preparation? If yes, what are the factors that contribute to this?
So I think it kind of stems from the expectations we set for our educators and what we want them walking in the door with. So for most states, it's mostly a master's degree, but is it a master's degree that's advanced practice that puts you in a clinically specialized area? Or is it specifically focused on how to teach in like a nursing education perspective? And so currently there's a lot of variation in what that baseline is. What are those expectations? So to help address that gap, I would say kind of going back to our state boards of nursing and looking at what do they want out of their nurses, and do they even require continuing education? So I think the gap exists based on multiple reasons, or things that impact it. But I think that's a good like starting point, is what are those expectations?
Right, right. And I'll highlight, there's no standard requirement to have pedagogical preparation to teach. It's as simple as that. That's the gap, is states to state, school to school. There is no standard requirement to have any sort of preparation to teach. And I would couple that gap also with financial considerations, that academics, we just cannot compete with the salaries of bedside nurses. And so I think that contributes to this gap in pedagogical preparation, because it's an add-on almost, and I hate to say that, but it's not a requirement for a lot of people that go into teaching. So
Yeah, and I want to highlight something that you wrote in your article, that article that you co-wrote, and this line about how interesting it is that AACN, for example, do not view nurse educator or nursing education as an advanced practice or even a specialty. And that goes back to what you're saying in terms of, well, we can't compete with the financial aspect of that then, because our counterparts elsewhere would be paid higher because they are at an advanced degree or advanced practice level. So what are your thoughts on that? So what are your thoughts, and I'm throwing this to both of you, what are your thoughts about, should we consider the nurse educator as an advanced practice?
I would say yes, because it's one thing to be a nurse in practice in a variety of areas, right? And even when you start those jobs, you get additional education and orientation to that specific area. Why not in teaching as well? We are doing something different. It's not the same as going and working with patients at the bedside. It really is its own thing to understand what you're trying to teach and then have it come across in a way that your students are going to understand it. And that doesn't come natural for everybody. And having some of that additional education behind it is important and impactful. At least that's kind of what we saw from my dissertation study, is that educators have such an impact based on how they do things, but that doesn't come without preparation.
mm-hmm. Right. And it's interesting that AACN has that perspective, because then CCNE, who does the accrediting, is still looking at the Masters in Nursing Education and looking at, are those programs, including the 3Ps, the clinical hours, so on and so forth. And so it's just an interesting dynamic between AACN and then CCNE, and how they're approaching this area of nursing education. And I would agree with Kyla. I think we're both clearly biased towards this being something that is special. You have to understand learning science. You have to understand, I mean, the theories, there's theoretical underpinnings of how learning works. And so you are going through a lot of specialized courses to really fully understand nursing education from that broader perspective. And so I would have to agree too that this is a specialization. You are setting yourself apart from others by taking, teaching and learning credits towards that master's in nursing education, or even a DNP or a PhD.
And that brings us back to the conversation of clinical expertise will not equate to expertise in education or educational pedagogy.
Mhm.
And therefore, I think one way to showcase that very point would be what are your observations or your experiences in terms of transition from a clinical expertise to teaching? So, what are the experiences of nurse educators on that transition?
I think in terms of preparedness, just like we see in practice, if you like with our nurse externs, for example, they have a little bit more practice under their belt, they're in the environment, they're going to feel a little bit more confident to go do that nursing role when the time comes. I think if somebody has maybe a degree where they have maybe like student teaching, or they're in the classroom, or they're in the clinical before they actually have to be there on their own, it would be fair to say that just having that would improve, hopefully, that transition, even if just a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, there's a whole role transition theory. We didn't talk about this in this specific article, but we did talk about it in another article, if I can just put a little plug about
Oh, yeah,
a comprehensive
definitely.
onboarding program that I facilitate. So Kyla helped me with data analysis on that. And the transition from clinical practice into being an educator is quite significant, and one that I don't think we give enough attention to. That I had one faculty participant, and she was quoted as saying, you know, the feedback I got at the bedside is not the feedback that I get as an educator. My patients are like, thank you, you know, whatever they say. Students are very different. And faculty
Mm-hmm.
colleague to faculty colleague, peer to peer is
Mm-hmm.
very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
And so that transition in and of itself is significant. And then if we add on that layer of if you have education preparation or not, or pedagogical preparation or not, that just compounds what a person can be experiencing in that transition into education. If at least you have some coursework under your belt, you're understanding the whys of what you're seeing and experiencing. Even if it's still all super new and you're a novice again,
Mm-hmm.
knowing like, oh, this is probably why this is happening with my students can help lessen how some of the negatives that people might experience bedside to education.
Right, exactly what you have said in that other article also, because think about this, what we have learned in nursing education is to practice as a nurse. And then therefore, if you are going to practice as an educator, what knowledge base do you need? Well, obviously, education, but then in many cases in the nursing education world, our clinical experts are transported into the world of nursing education, and then kind of like we expect them to be magically expert educators as well. But you're very right there. The role transition process is something that we really have to consider in this world of academic preparation. And it's just very interesting to look at it that way. And then looking at what are the consequences of inadequately prepared educators. I think that's something that we have to think of as a nursing education community and the ethics of it, right? So let me transition then into questions about like, let's talk a little bit about like what are the effects of nurse educators' non-preparedness or inadequate preparation for nursing education?
Yeah, so I think for this, at least from like what I saw in my research study, is that students, they are very quick to say like, oh, somebody's doing this one way, or my learning doesn't resonate with how this person's educating. And they're very quick to say all the negative things that they don't like about their experience, but they're not always talking about the good things that happen. The other thing I was thinking is that if educators don't have that background or that additional preparation, they might not be using maybe the most evidence-based strategies. And then kind of going back to what we said is if they don't have it, they rely on how they were educated. And so students then are like, well, I'm not getting what I need, or maybe there's a mismatch in how somebody's educating versus how the students are learning. And so even though an educator might have good intentions, it might not always translate to good learning for the students. So how they implement it is also important. So that's kind of my thoughts on that one.
Well, kind of like if you're saying it that way, think about we're always ruminating on this concept of the education practice gap, right? So we're always looking at why are students inadequately prepared. So if we are to graduate nurses who are going to be able to practice and navigate what we want them to be able to do, competencies, in other words, how are we educating them? But then if we don't have that evidence-based set of knowledge to teach, it could be like, yes, yeah, it's a no-brainer. We are educating our future nurses with what? But where did we learn all of this? So thus, it goes back to education on how to educate, which is, of course, back to your point, both of you, is that, well, there's no standard preparation. If there are also consequences on the institutions themselves or programs, if you will, or even our own nurse educator community, what could be the consequences of non-standard preparation or inadequate preparation of our faculty? What's the effect? What would be an effect of that in our programs or in our, I guess, faculty groups?
Mhm. I'll jump in here. I think one thing we want to make sure we're clear on is that having educator preparation, obtaining the CNE, the certified nurse educator, doesn't equal being a good teacher either. I think it does help people, again, and I said this a little earlier, understand the whys behind what's going on, right? And I think that I always say this, student behavior is a form of communication. And if you understand learning theory, like behaviorism, for example, which will correspond to competency-based a lot, because we're looking at what our students doing and showing us, you can kind of navigate some of those curricular decisions in a different way if you have that underpinning. So I will die on the hill that we should all know about learning theory and learning science at a minimum. But I think if we have any sort of standardized preparation across the board, it helps us all have a shared mental model. And I think that is maybe some of the missing pieces. We have expert clinicians who are really amazing faculty. They are. When you couple them up with somebody that has some pedagogical preparation, that understands some of that learning science, how learning works, that's where the magic happens, I think. And just think of the possibilities if all of us had some sort of underlying preparation, what could happen to curricula across the board if that did become something that was standardized. And I think with thinking about educator competencies are consequences of, having an adequate knowledge base and being prepared to teach. I always think of what's our ethical obligation to students. And, it takes a team. It takes that experience. It takes mentoring and peer support to really bring all those pieces together, coupled with a CNE. So I want to just make sure, like, we're not saying CNE equals good. It just means you understand why. Like I think the whys behind everything is really essential for us to help with all the things we're talking about.
You just unpack a lot of concepts there. Amber, you talk about what's the value of CNE. Yes, it does not equate to competencies either, if you will, relating it to my own personal experiences and hearing other faculty preparing for CNE and their comments like, oh, finally, I know what this is.
Right.
And
Mhm.
right,
Right.
right. And these are faculty members who have been teaching maybe like a few years already, and now they're just saying, "Oh, now this is why we do this." Right? It's
Mhm.
backwards.
It's the why or having a name. Like I hear the, oh, that's what that's called.
Right, right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then think of, and I like the word you use, and I'll borrow that. Think of the magic that could happen if you have this strong clinical expertise coupled with like strong pedagogical background,
Right.
and therefore, what would that standard preparation would be? And you said, well, of course, theory of learning is number one, right? And we can probably name a few more into that mix of the standard and therefore or standards. And now I think it's also a conversation of what could be possible ways to make this happen. I know it's like, ooh, we can make this happen, but how? What are your thoughts on that?
Um, Amber, do you want to go first so I can ruminate on this?
So how do we make this happen? I have lots of ideas. I think something that you may ask us coming up, Raquel, but I'm going to say it now is having standardized expectations for educators would really help us, again, have that shared mental model. However, credentialing in nursing education is not looked at the same way as it is as credentialing as like a peds specialist or older adult specialists. And so that is one thing to note here. With that, having the standard expectations, we don't want it to become a barrier to people coming into faculty roles, because if it's not standard as part of what everybody has to do, and it's part of what's infused into the culture of a college of nursing or school of nursing, I could see us having some issues. For example, in higher ed, there are some places that'll pay for people to get their CNE, and there's others that don't, and they don't pay for any certifications for their faculty because it's not a requirement to teach, right? So that's one thing to note. I think what we have to think about with kind of making this kind of standardized process is how are faculty being onboarded, and how are we infusing, again, just I'm going to name it learning theory, into an onboarding program. So at least they're getting that to then broaden out into more development as they go. Hopefully I answered your question there.
Add is that for new educators, it's a great learning tool, right? They're preparing for this new role. It's something that maybe they want to invest in because they know they're going to use it. The thing I question is, well, what about our like mid-career faculty who've been here doing this for a while, or the ones who are close to retirement? Like, how do you really standardize those expectations for those folks that are realistic and doesn't I don't like offend their experience or their wisdom. So I think it's a bigger, broader question than just what can we do now? We really have to think about all the pieces to the puzzle to give that answer.
Yeah, and if we're thinking of nurse educators as having standardized expected competencies as well, which brings us, of course, to the essence of the CNE certification, where it's organized around the expectations or competencies of the faculty. But we can also think about leveling of competencies, right? Of course, the new or novice educator would
Right.
be at this level. Somebody who'd been teaching for 25 years or more should be considered an expert. So it's still that novice to expert expectations there within the frame of expected competencies. And therefore, think about other professions, even in nursing, right? Your competencies are expected to progress from being a novice to expert. What about nurse educators then? Do we have that expectations for ourselves? And what would be the measure? Like CNE, is that really a measure of competency? And then in terms of faculty development, continuing development, what do we have? And I like what you said in terms of onboarding. What's that onboarding like? And then again, standardization of onboarding for faculty, that's probably another podcast
Yeah.
by itself. So, but yeah, well, but let me one more point, point out one more point from the article that you said is about what are the roles of states? Could they be significant, if lack of a better word? What's their significance in helping this standardization? Or do we really want that to go there? Right? It would be a good question as well.
Yeah, I think in terms of states, they have the potential to be helpful. Like if we just look at like continuing education in general from state to state, if it's a requirement for nurses, I would hope that those who are doing those education credits are picking things that are meaningful to them and useful in their development. And so if somebody knows they're going to be transitioning into education, maybe that's the time and the place to say, okay, this is where I'm going to do that additional preparation. However, not everyone's going to think that way, or it's more seen as a barrier. It's another thing I have to do. And so there's kind of pros and cons to saying, hey, let's do it this way. But that's just like a starting point. At least that's kind of the way I see it.
Right. And we're always cognizant of the shortage as well, right? So nurse workforce shortage, nursing faculty shortage, and where do we stay in that to balance our expectations, wish, future as nurse educators, and then of course the needs that we're facing as well. So yeah, so these are all very good points and highlights, and therefore, as we kind of like try to close our conversation, I want to ask both of you. So, what are some of the nuggets, or I would say lessons, that you can share with us and the nursing education community about all of these lessons that you have learned, your research on nursing education, professional development, or preparation of nurse educators?
For me, I would say that that nugget is that if anyone's considering transitioning into nursing education, that your impact is potentially exponential. And so students are going to see that way, your peers are going to see it that way. And so the more prepared you can be, and that's going to look different for everybody, but what you can do to prepare yourself for that transition, but then also that impact is really important and it doesn't go unnoticed.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that our administrators, our leaders are also listening as we speak, right?
Right.
Uh-huh. And who is here today? Amber.
I was going to say, I have a
Yeah.
whole different lens on this and how we have to think about it. And,
Yes.
you know, just a couple of things I want to end with. One, we need more data to have some data informed decision making. And I know there's some research going on. I saw a LinkedIn recruitment post of, do you have your CNE? We'd like to talk to you. And I think if we can get some more data, correlational data between, you know, pedagogical preparation, whatever that looks like, and student outcomes, that's one thing to help us work with policy within our institutions, but also policy at those state boards of nursing of should there be something standardized, because here's what the data is showing. And we might not see anything. You know, that's the cool thing about research. You don't know until you start to gather this data to make your decisions. And I would say then with that is falling back on the novice to expert that you brought up, Raquel, is being intentional about how we onboard people into their faculty roles is something I'm very aware of. Because when you are a novice in education, okay, expert in practice, but I'm sorry, now you are novice again, and it's really uncomfortable. What do we need to do first? to help building people and their experience. What do we do at that midpoint? So I have a National Science Foundation grant, and I'm finding that midpoint faculty are the prime group because they have enough experience to know what they're experiencing and seeing, but they know they have still a lot of room to grow, right? And so how do we think about that with our nurse educators coming in, and that novice to expert is the timing of the faculty development and what we're doing at what point. And then as an administrator, I was thinking as we've been talking today, how are administrators weaving in competencies into their peer evaluations and their annual evaluations? And what do those look like across all of our nursing programs? I would like to think there's some similarities, but I don't know. I haven't looked into this, but that's another area of how are we weaving this in if we think it's important into our evaluation processes to help people feel supported and, want to grow. Like Kyla has said a few times, this is a lot of times a personal endeavor that they want to do for themselves. And so how do we support and foster that through some of our evaluation processes?
Right, like personal motivations, professional motivations, definitely, and so much more. And I know we can go on talking about this because this is a topic that I think that is close to our hearts as educators because we're essentially talking about ourselves here. And therefore, it's hard to summarize what we've talked about because we've talked about so many areas of educational preparation of the educator in nursing. But to end this conversation, I would like to thank both of you for being here and sharing your thoughts and expertise and really also stimulating more thinking about what else do we need to talk about this very topic also in the future. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so that ends our episode for today, and we'll see you in our next episode.